In 1977, the band sat around a table with their managers and accountants discussing their uncertain future. While Robbie Robertson was looking to buy out his bandmate's shares, they pitched yet another money-making scheme that one accountant declares a genius idea. That was the breaking point for Levon Helm. He shot to his feet, eyes blazing. Genius my ass. There ain't a genius within walking distance of this self-infatuated crowd. He cussed them out to the point he had to leave town immediately. Speaking about them, he says, "They put the IRS after me. That's what kind of people we're talking about here." Not more than a year later, the recording studio named Shangri-La, located in Malibu, California, was being shut down. Richard Manuel had been living out of one of the bungalows on the property when management tried to get him to move out. He didn't have anywhere else to go and continued to stay as they shut off the phone and then the gas. Levon stopped by to check on him one night when he finds Richard cooking minute steaks on an upside-down clothes iron. He describes the scene in his autobiography. The thing was set on cotton. Richard would drop a pat of butter on the hot iron, slap on a steak, flip it over, drop another butter pat, and eat it right off the grill, so to speak. When they finally get him out of there, it took them a couple of days to clean out the 2,000 Grand Marnier bottles they found. Today, people tell me all the time how much they love the Last Waltz. I try to thank them politely and usually refrain from mentioning that for me, it was a real scandal. But Robbie Robertson sees it completely differently, describing it in his posthumous memoir as the greatest music film of all time. He details the 2 years he spent living with Martin Scorsese, making the film as a labor of love mixed with a lot of debauchery. So how is it that two band members that once considered themselves brothers could come away with completely different perspectives on the same experience that concluded their 16-year journey? I'll present you both sides and allow you to decide why they felt so differently and how that led to the band's demise. The band was a traveling group called the Hawks and were playing gigs on the road all over the US and Canada for 8 years before meeting Bob Dylan. Levon describes their lifestyle like this: "I was the road. It was my life. And I was living it to the hilt and beyond. We may have had a hard time getting credit cards and insurance, but we felt freer than anyone else in the land as we crisscrossed province, prairie, and state. We didn't have to answer to anybody. It was the kind of life where if you had a problem today, you could be 500 miles away from it the next day." But Levon left that lifestyle he loved so much when they were touring with Bob Dylan during his contentious tour in '65, when they were booed, had things thrown at them, and caused an uproar everywhere they went. He says he was too sensitive to bear it, but the other guys stuck it out and followed Bob to Woodstock, where he basically taught them how to write songs. Levon gets the call from Rick in late '67 when they finally get a record contract and he returns to the band in Woodstock. He discovers they've developed miles beyond where they were when he left them 2 years earlier. Richard tells Levon how they'd been working with Bob since March, when he started coming by every day at the same time, and they would go downstairs into their makeshift studio in the basement and play music they felt like playing or songs they had just written. Richard says to Levon, "It's like real work." Bob and Rick wrote This Wheel's on Fire, while Richard and Bob wrote Tears of Rage. Robbie had always been writing songs since he joined the Hawks when they were teenagers.
And watching Bob, helping Bob construct some songs, everybody got a better idea of how to put a song together, and learned that there wasn't any set formula. A song could happen from a groove or from an idea, from a title, from a story.
And from doing that, a lot of good arrangements came from that, a lot of musical ideas, and just us living our lives, just establishing some little life rules. It was an incredible time period.
Around this time, there was a reaction to the unrest in the country and a movement towards what Levon described as country values. And that's why the band's sound hit the spot, with so many fed up with the Age of Aquarius music by '68. The Hawks were coming up with new ideas for band names when Levon suggested the Honkies. But in Woodstock, they'd become so beloved, where they were known as Bob Dylan's band, that when people ask about them, they'd say, "Is the band in town?" And that's the name that stuck. So when their album started coming out, they began to notice that the writing credits were mostly listed as J.R. Robertson instead of the actual band member who Levon says wrote the songs. They thought that was kind of funny, but were so caught up in their newfound success that they barely mentioned it. Their producer John Simon says, in those days that's how it was done. If there was a group, one guy tended to write the songs and get credit for them. It kept things relatively simple that way. But Levon saw Richard as the main songwriter, with him and Rick and Robbie also writing some songs. He thought by the second album it would get corrected, and when the songs got credited to Robertson, he approached Robbie, who had become close with their manager Albert Grossman. Robbie assures him that everything will work out with the royalties once Albert builds a new state-of-the-art studio for them to record in as they pleased. Levon points out that the royalty changes never materialized. Around this same time, they are being referred to by critics as the best band in America and enjoying a great deal of fame as they begin to work on their third album, Stage Fright. Levon says this is when the stage is being set for the Last Waltz, despite owing the record company 8 more albums.
Virgil Kane is the name, and I served on the Danville train.
He describes the crowd at Woodstock Music Festival as real tired and real unhealthy, saying as soon as they were done playing, they got out of there. Albert Grossman refused their movie rights to the documentary in exchange for their fee, so they were not in the film as a result. In July 1973, they played a festival in Watkins Glen, New York with the Grateful Dead and the Allman Brothers Band to 250,000 people. Richard describes it as a hell of a lot better than Woodstock, and Levon says it is burned in my memory. In 1974, they joined back up with Bob Dylan for a tour, and this time they were met with a completely different response than the animosity of 1965, just 9 years earlier. Levon tells of the electricity when Dylan entered the stage. We understood that people were excited by Bob's comeback after a long public absence, but we were astounded anyway when he walked on stage in the darkened hall in Chicago and saw the entire audience stand and hold up flaring lighters in a roar of tribute to Bob. He says the normally stoic Dylan is moved to the point of not being able to face the crowd. They performed the same songs they played in '65, but with a completely different response. The album of the tour went on to become their legendary live album, Before the Flood.
I pulled in another room, just a feeling by 8:30.
In 1976, after finishing a concert at Stanford with the Flying Burrito Brothers, Robbie's daughter's been born and the band was seeing less and less of each other. Rick signed a solo record deal because he couldn't take being so still while Richard was recovering from a neck injury. Robbie tells Levon he is ready to hang it up and stop touring. He wants to spend more time with his family. Levon couldn't understand this and thought he was joking initially, but he wasn't. Robbie goes on to tell Levon of his worries about being on the road and that it was too dangerous after their friend had died in an airplane crash, as well as other musicians who had lost their lives on the road, saying, "Do we have to spend the rest of our lives on the road, man? Until we can't stand each other like Sam and Dave, man? Effing knife fights in the dressing room?" They soon get word from management in September that their final show will be in San Francisco, where they launched the band, and it would be a star-studded event with everyone who influenced them throughout the years. And that was that. It was decided for them. Levon says they were nowhere near being ready to stop touring, especially after those monumental live concerts they had leading up to this. Levon meets with Robbie in early October to protest the breakup of the band. He described Robbie as barely able to open his eyes as he'd been up all night producing a Neil Diamond album. Levon says they will go on as the band without him, as Robbie responds they would stop them legally. This is when he catches wind that the final concert will also be filmed for a documentary. The concert and a feast scheduled for Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, 1976 at the Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco features an extraordinary lineup of guest musicians. They had everyone lined up and agreed to play, including Ronnie Hawkins, Dr. John, Neil Young, Neil Diamond, Joni Mitchell, Muddy Waters, Paul Butterfield, Van Morrison, Ringo Starr, Ron Wood, and Bob Dylan. Warner Brothers agrees to put them on a retainer for $2,000 a week each throughout the process, along with rights to the film. Levon says he was completely against the film and didn't understand why someone like Neil Diamond would be included because he has absolutely nothing to do with the band. He was informed that Robbie had just produced his album and wanted to perform a couple of their songs. Levon says the film was more or less shoved down their throats and would be done live with one take. Levon recalls that they went to Mo Ostin at Warner Brothers and asked for the money to shoot the film. Austin is reluctant and only agrees to it if Bob Dylan agrees to be in the film. So they go to Bob and ask him, and he doesn't want to do it because he has been finishing up his Ronaldo and Clara film from the Rolling Thunder tour and didn't want to compete with himself. But according to Levon, Robbie and management tell Austin that Bob did agree to be in the film, so he fronted them $1.5 million to make it. They go back and forth, and Bob keeps saying, "I don't know, man. I need to talk to management," clearly hoping they will let it go. So all the way up to the day of the concert, they still don't have his agreement to be in the film. There are 9 cameras set up pointing directly at the stage, mind you. At 6 p.m., the doors open as people who pay $25 enjoy a feast of 220 turkeys, 500 pounds of cranberry sauce, 90 gallons of brown gravy, a ton of candied yams, 800 pounds of mincemeat, 6,000 rolls, and 400 gallons of cider. The stuffing was made of 500 pounds of onions and celery, 70 bunches of parsley, and 16 quarts of herbs sauteed in 100 pounds of butter. And if you didn't eat meat, you could sample some of the 400 pounds of fresh salmon and then get up to dance to a 38-piece orchestra encouraged by 3 teams of professional ballroom dancers.
When I get off of this mountain, you know where I wanna go.
The concert began around 9 p.m. as the band played their most popular songs before any of the guest performers came on stage. Bob arrives during the first half of the show and goes directly into his dressing room. About 15 minutes before he was set to go on stage, he tells them he doesn't want to be in the film. Robbie went totally pale and Scorsese went berserk. Without him, there was no film, and they would have to pay the money back. Everyone kept going in trying to get him to change his mind, but it was Bill Graham who said, "That's it, I'm going to get him to do it." He entered the dressing room as everyone waited, holding their breath. Bill finally emerges with 5 minutes left before stage time and says, Bob agrees to be in it, but only for 2 songs. By 3 a.m., the Last Waltz was over. It was one of those nights Levon says you didn't want to let go of.
Don't delay. Don't you break my heart.
The following February 1977, Robbie Robertson had been asked by his wife to leave their home. He briefly stayed in a room at Shangri-La Recording Studio before winding up at Martin Scorsese's house on Mulholland, where he was invited to move in as Marty's wife had also recently moved out, leaving both men newly single with a film to finish. He describes trying to explain to the guys in the band all that it took to make a film and saying they understood it to the best of their ability. He cites Richard Manuel's drinking problem as why they needed to get off the road. Robbie recalls in his latest memoir, Insomnia, "I was tired of pulling the train up the hill, tired of trying to figure out what to do with Richard's situation, and I was tired of Levon, who was becoming more and more difficult to deal with." When he tells Levon he finally got the money to make the film, he says Levon tells him, "F the film, let's just use the concert and keep the money." A shocked Robbie doesn't understand why Levon can't see how great this documentary could be and all that it took to make it. Robbie tells Levon, "This could be one of the best music films ever made. We have to see this through." At Marty's house, they initially spend a lot of time screening movies as he taught Robbie details to look out for in old films. Robbie compares them to a whacked out odd couple. As Scorsese was meticulous about every detail, and Robbie was used to the freewheeling rock and roll life on the road where everyone cleaned up after you. Each of the artists get to screen their part of the film before signing off. When Neil Young sees his part, he says he can't be in the film due to a rock of coke in his nose that is visible, not wanting his kids to see that someday. So they had to go through some special effects to remove that before he agreed to sign off. 2 production assistants, Ava and Sylvia, who are young women in their 20s, arrange a screening at MGM with the heads of the Cannes Film Festival. Along with the Cannes people, they invite 2 Hells Angels, one of which recited a poem during the Last Waltz film named Sweet William. Suddenly, towards the end of the screening, Ava and Sylvia call Marty and Robbie in a panic because Sweet William went ballistic and was holding them hostage. He started screaming at the top of his lungs after his performance. He is making demands for drugs and money and has them locked in a room. Finally, Sweet William gets on the phone with Robbie and says, "You've shortened my poem and taken the soul out of it." He goes on to tell him by cutting out the middle of the very long poem, he disgraced his tale about the killing of another Hell's Angel in Florida by the cops. He then demands $1,000, an ounce of coke, and his full poem back in the movie, or, quote, "You can't imagine what we're going to do to your little secretaries." Robbie then remembers another leader within the Hells Angels, Sonny Barger, that he knows personally, who he brings up to Sweet William, saying, "Why don't we get his input about the poem?" Sweet William stops and finally responds, "I don't want Sonny to have to decide, or anyone else. Cut me out of the movie, that's all. I can't live with it like this, so just take me out." They then up and leave MGM. Robbie describes the money coming from United Artists going towards the additional filming, editing, and mixing, saying they would only get paid the profit sharing of the film, calling it a labor of love and madness. During this time, Robbie is dating his wife's best friend, but is not entirely convinced his marriage is over, and he finds himself confused over the entire situation. He writes a song for the soundtrack called Out of the Blue about his wife, in which the band comes together at Shangri-La to record. He gets the feeling that everyone had one foot out the door, and realized the distance that had grown between them despite their musical bond. Throughout Levon's accounts, you can hear the bitterness unfold as he tells off Martin Scorsese at one point during the interviews for the film, saying, "I was coarse and rude, country rude, because I was so damn angry." Levon does not hold back on his distaste towards him regarding the film and how he perceives his hand in the demise of the productivity of the band. Next, the guys in the band screen the movie. Robbie says Rick thought the film was tremendous. Garth tried to stay awake due to his narcolepsy, and Richard commented on the great performances by Van, Joni, Bob, and Muddy. He doesn't mention Levon's reaction except when mentioning Lawrence Ferlinghetti's poem Loud Prayer, which is a take on the Lord's Prayer. He brings up Levon's Southern Baptist upbringing as he remarks, "Somebody could be struck by lightning screwing around with the Bible. We ought not to be messing with that kind of shit, boys." Ferlinghetti. In Levon's book, he makes it very clear he hates the film and sees it as Robbie's way into the Hollywood scene at his band's expense. He says after the screening ended, "I was in shock over how bad the movie was. 9 cameras on the floor, and there wasn't even a shot of Richard Manuel singing the finale, 'I Shall Be Released,' his trademark song." He basically feels the whole film is edited in a way to focus on Robbie, and there's barely any shots of Richard or Garth during the concert, and the interviews all make it seem like it's Robbie's band. He says Ronnie Hawkins even made a joke at the end of the screening that the movie would be alright had there just have been more shots of Robertson. Robbie details Levon's frustration with Richard being drunk during some of the interviews and taking Levon's concerns about the film to Rick, who seemed to agree with Robbie on allowing Richard to just be himself. But they are starting to pit each other against one another at this point, whether they know it or not. It's around this time that Levon tells everyone off at the meeting. As the film is making its way through screenings, Robbie's fallen into the Hollywood scene as he tells some hilarious stories about wild nights with Scorsese and the likes of Liza Minnelli, Robert De Niro, and Harvey Keitel. They had begun shooting Raging Bull during this time period. During the Cannes Film Festival, they arrive as angry crowds outside waiting scream "fascist" at Martin Scorsese because of their perception of his American views on the films he made. Robbie is interviewed by Andy Warhol for his magazine interview. They enjoy catching up and recalling old times at the Chelsea Hotel with Edie Sedgwick, Nico, and Salvador Dali. They laugh about the time Andy gave Dylan a silkscreen of Elvis and Bob immediately traded it with Albert Grossman for a couch. Back in London at the Savoy Hotel, they meet up with Jack Nicholson, who tells them about the film he's working on with Stanley Kubrick about a family in an old mountain resort, and the man is losing his mind. The movie is called The Shining. Jack describes to them a scene they worked on where his character hacks his way through the door, and he spontaneously comes up with the line,
Here's Johnny.
which Kubrick finds hilarious and keeps in the movie. While editing Raging Bull, Marty turned to Robbie to help with the soundtrack. He brought in Garth and Richard to help on a song and play a 1940s New York jazz scene. It would be the first of many soundtracks he worked on for Scorsese films. After all the accolades of The Last Waltz came pouring out and everything settled down, Robbie describes that the rest of the band had left California and moved back to Woodstock. He says he couldn't imagine going back there, believing their physical distance led to their personal connection drifting them apart. He began working on a film called Carney with Gary Busey. One day, Rick and Gary came to visit him at his house, and Rick describes checking in on Garth since his house burned down in Malibu. Garth sat on a hill powerless watching his house burn to the ground, and Rick says, "Hey, let's give Levon a call." They call him up as he's sitting watching basketball. Robbie tells Levon about a film director who asked about him to play a part as Loretta Lynn's father in an upcoming movie. He liked his presence in The Last Waltz. He says Levon's response is dismissive, saying, "Hell, Loretta's older than me." He then gets off the phone and gets back to his game. Of course, he would go on to play that role and several others. But Robbie says it is at this point that he sees he himself has changed. His time with the band was incredible and they had become brothers, but Levon was, quote, limited in his vision and ambitions, happy to go round and round playing music in the same old circuit. I couldn't stand still like that. I wanted to make original music, to find new sounds. But in this group, it came to feel like I was the only one who had these thoughts. I'd had to take over the reins of our direction. If I'd left it up to Levon, we would have never joined up with Bob Dylan. He went along with it for a while to appease me, but he hated it so much. He eventually quit his own band. I didn't even know you could do that. There would have been no Basement Tapes or Big Pink if it was left up to him. No Last Waltz. Levon saw Robbie's move to evolve into movies as a betrayal, and Robbie saw Levon and the band holding him back. So, did Robbie make questionable decisions with songwriting credits? Possibly, but he says that Levon just didn't understand how it all worked. So it's hard to say because the other guys didn't seem to have the same grievances, at least publicly, and they never saw a dime of the money from the film due to it being over budget. And there it was. That's what the demise all came down to. Differences in how the publishing rights were distributed and how the band's end was handled. Richard's life ended heartbreakingly sad on the road with the band sans Robertson in 1983. And when Rick died suddenly in his sleep at age 56, Levon made it clear who he held responsible, saying, "Rick worked too hard. He wasn't that old and he wasn't that sick. He just worked himself to death." And the reason Rick worked all the time was because he had been effed out of his money. People ask me what I think of The Last Waltz all the time. Rick Danko dying at 56 is what I think about The Last Waltz. It was the biggest effing ripoff that ever happened to the band, without a doubt. As the band members began going their own ways, the animosity between Levon and Robbie during The Last Waltz irreparably fractured their bond, leading to the band's demise. The others stayed mostly quiet, though they toured without Robbie, likely out of financial need. To fans, the riff felt like watching old friends in a feud, each with their own side of the story. Both men likely shared some of the blame. Robbie later said there was no feud from his side and that he'd made peace with Levon before his death. Levon loved life on the road. Touring made him feel alive. Robbie, meanwhile, was drawn to filmmaking and storytelling and wanted more time with his young family, a choice that made sense but left Levon feeling left out in the cold. The disputes over songwriting and royalties deepened the divide. If Robbie acted unfairly behind the scenes, that's hard to forgive. But it's also a lesson on protecting your own interests early on, before resentment takes root. This story is a great reminder that just because you have a long history with someone, it doesn't mean that they share the same moral clarity or vision as you. They were looking at the situation from two different levels. Robbie took a rational approach to how he saw the situation and decided he was ready to move on while being more business savvy, while Levon was coming from a relationship level with what they refer to as brothers. So he took it personally when Robbie didn't live up to that expectation. But life has a funny way of coming full circle. After Robbie's death in 2023, in a twist that would have made Levon smirk, the band's old feud over money didn't exactly die with them. It just changed cast members. After decades of Robertson being painted as the guy who walked away with the band's fortune during their time of need, his own children are now in court battling his much younger widow over control of his estate. The same arguments about who really owns the riches that began with the band. They are alleging financial elder abuse and torturous interference with inheritance. The lawsuit claims his widow took advantage of Robertson while he was in declining health after a recent surgery, coercing him into signing documents that she allegedly knew he didn't understand due to medication. The children are seeking to cancel these documents, which they claim grant her an unfavorable life estate in their father's home, forcing them to pay expenses until she dies. Demise. In a strangely poetic echo of the band's original breakup drama, Robbie's kids are now accusing his widow of doing to him what Levon long claimed Robbie did to the rest of the band, taking advantage of someone at a vulnerable moment to secure a financial upper hand. The parallels are hard to ignore. Of course, they are now all gone while their stories and music live on. It's good that Robbie and Levon got to make peace before Levon passed away. Our time here is short. Make peace today, because tomorrow is promised to no one. Thank you for watching. I'll put a link to the uncensored version with longer music excerpts available on the Patreon page in the description if you want to watch that and be so kind as to support my work. This was a complicated story because it spanned so many years and there were several points of contention and 2 different versions of events. Hopefully I showed grace to both sides. Almost everyone knows what it feels like to be ripped off and also to be blamed for something due to a misunderstanding. It's easy to jump to conclusions based on our own experiences and project that when making up our mind. I look for evidence and patterns in people's behavior when making up my own mind. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll put a link in the description as well to the books if you want to get more into their stories, as well as the music featured here. I highly recommend both. Thanks again. See you next video.